Hi, my name's Dr. Eric Lybeck, and I'm here in Liverpool to introduce a new series of courses that I'm calling Understanding Modernity. So, right now I'm walking down by the Liverpool waterfront and just going to go through the kind of plan of action for this course and kind of what it's going to be about. So, the goal here is to understand modern society, not necessarily as something that really exists or definitely exists. That's going to be a question that we're going to deal with. But we're going to look at kind of peak modernity, high modernity, working out at about 1950s, 60s, sort of mid 20th century. And the way that we got there from kind of pre-modern society to that modern society was via four revolutions. And we're going to look at these four revolutions. So the first is going to be the Industrial Revolution, so transformations in the economic world, and especially beginning around the turn of the 18th century. Then we're going to look at democratic revolutions, which was occurring around the same time, and that tends to be dated around 1789, the French Revolution, and so forth. Next, we're going to look at the scientific revolution, which lots of folks say began earlier, and we can look at the rise of science and technology beginning around the 17th century or so. But then things really picked up also in the 19th century with the institutionalization of universities and sort of industrialized science. Finally, we're going to look at the communications revolution and the rise of what might be considered a mass society. So the mass media and the construction of populations as a big sort of mass. Now, we're calling each of these four things revolutions, but they're not very speedy. The democratic revolution took at least 100, almost 200 years to actually come to fruition. Similarly, the Industrial Revolution went through several different phases. The first organized around steam, then later around electricity, chemicals, eventually computers, and now people even talk about the fourth Industrial Revolution. So these are really long-term processes, but we're going to call them revolutions regardless. And what we're going to try and do is understand the transition from what would be basically a pre-modern or early modern society, and the transition to modern society, and then eventually postmodern society. So it's kind of building up to this particular configuration or idea of how society works, and then almost as soon as it gets established, it sort of starts to fall apart. And we're sort of living through the aftermath of that right now. So if we want to understand what's going on today and what's happened in the past, what's happening in the future, we really are going to want to understand these long-term processes that we're sort of in the middle of. And so we'll be doing that across these series of lectures. And so hope you'll join me on the rest of the course. Okay, so just to recap, it's the Industrial Revolution, Democratic Revolution, Scientific Revolution, and Communications Revolution. And each of those corresponds to different dimensions that are the economic, political, cultural dimensions of modern society. And as I mentioned, what we're trying to do here is to understand the transition from modern to postmodern societies. So we're going to try and understand what is it that's distinctive about modern societies, and how do those dynamics feed into the transition to postmodern societies? Because ultimately we're interested in understanding our contemporary, more or less postmodern societies. And in order to do that, we need to go back and understand the transition from traditional societies to modern societies. So this is a kind of we're looking at the processes in terms of the early modern, pre-modern, traditional societies, and how those became the modern societies, so that we can then understand the transition to postmodernity. Now, the modern societies all have counterparts in postmodernity. So industrialism leads to post-industrialism. Others scholars talk about Fordism and that system of regulation, and then that becomes post-Fordism. Nation states are sort of the quintessential political structure that emerges by the end of the modern process, but then very quickly that becomes globalization and sort of transnational processes that go beyond the nation state. And modernism in art, architecture, culture, that becomes postmodernism, as we'll discuss. And finally, within the communications revolution, we talk about this establishing an idea of mass society, of society as a mass of identical humans in a crowd. And this is driven in a lot of ways by the media forms that develop in the course of modernity. But then, as soon as that takes hold and we hit post-war mass society, very soon these forms of identity start to break down, and we're going to look at intersectionality and new forms of inequality and differentiation, so that we're back to a condition where everyone's an individual, or at least we think. So these trends are kind of what we're going to be following, but we're also going to be looking at the counter trends, and this is something quite distinctive about how I'd like to approach this. Usually we talk about modernity as a certain set of trends and processes, such as the emergence of the Enlightenment or the drive towards capitalism, but these are always reacted to, they're resisted, they're contested by radical movements, conservative movements, reactionary movements, populist movements. And so modernity, it doesn't just consist of the trends themselves, it consists of the trends and the counter-trends working things out. So in a certain sense, the actual modern process isn't just the features of modernity that we're going to talk about. It's modernity plus its opposites. And its discontents. So that's kind of what we're going to be looking at there. We're going to pay special attention to institutions, because these institutions get reconfigured and the relations between them change. So politics and economics and culture are always working out in certain ways in any society, but there's a particular way that these institutions get reconfigured during the transition from pre-modernity to modernity, and then those in turn get transferred again into a new set of arrangements that we find in postmodernity. And once we've done this, we should be able to see what is distinctly novel about modern societies. So there's certain schools of thought that think that modernity is a myth, it's Eurocentric, it's patriarchal, and all of those things are probably true, as we're going to discuss. But there is something distinctive about modernity, and it's a question that's sort of sociologists have tried to tackle and deal with for quite a long time, because there is something distinctive and novel about both modernity and then now postmodernity. And the goal here in looking at these over the long term and through long-term processes is that we should be able to identify those novel and distinct aspects of modernity and postmodernity through this form of study. And so next time, what we'll do is look at the Industrial Revolution, and that should set us up to really understand what sets off the modern society and really gets things going from an economic point of view. And please do subscribe if you'd like to find more about our course, Understanding Modernity. And I'm your host again, Dr. Eric Lybeck, and I will see you next time.